Mission always calls us to cross boundaries. Discipleship happens in the ordinary and the everyday and the weekly rhythms of church life, but yet I also believe that there needs to be a great intentionality in those things. It's not a factory where we just put the right things in and we expect the disciple to pop out the other end. It's actually that we sow and we water and we watch the ground and we weed. More recently, as I've been seeing the church cross boundaries, actually I've been noticing that God tends to be already there, and we join with him in his great mission.
A very warm welcome to the Lausanne Movement podcast. For those who have a passion to accelerate global mission together. I'm your host, Jason Watson, and today I'm delighted to share an interview that I had with Rick Hill, the leader of Mission in Ireland for the Presbyterian Church of Ireland. Rick previously worked as a discipleship development officer for the denomination and is the author of Deep Roots of Resilient Disciples. In our conversation, Rick invites us to rethink discipleship, not as a program to be run, but as a life-on-life journey of formation. He traces the movement of Jesus' call from come and see to go and make disciples and explores the key spaces where this kind of formation happens. Rick also helps us understand the rapidly changing spiritual landscape of Ireland and unpacks and shares inspiring initiatives they as a church are doing to see revitalization across the island. And so, if you have a passion to see resilient, disciple-making churches for every people and place, then this episode is for you. And I want to invite you to grab your headphones and let's dive into today's interview with Rick Hill. Well, Rick, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you with us.
Hi, Jason. I've been a long-time listener, so it's good to arrive on this side of the microphone.
No, it's great. I at this stage, I don't think I've recorded with anyone in Ireland. And so I'm really excited to chat with you, to hear your insights. Particularly today, we're going to be diving into church. We're going to be just talking about discipleship. We'd love to hear more about what's happening in the church in Ireland. But to kick us off, I'd love for you just to have an opportunity to share your story and share a bit of your journey with our audience. So I'm going to hand it over to you, and you can take us from there.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Well, I'm living in Belfast, just outside Belfast here in Northern Ireland. I've lived in this corner of the island for almost all of my life. I'm married to Sarah. We have 3 young kids. I'm a part of a church there. I'm an elder in a local church here. I've been in various ministry roles, and I'm currently working for the Presbyterian Church in Ireland with a responsibility for our home mission department or mission in Ireland. So I'll maybe talk about that as we go. But in terms of serving the Lord, I would say I've carried a strong desire to serve God ever since I put my trust in him. So nurtured well in the things of faith as a child and young person, even though I wouldn't have always lived in a way that honored him growing up. But I've been around the church all my life, and in some ways serving him in ministry has kind of felt like a natural step and outworking of my faith at every point on my journey. So I guess more formally, after theological education, I served God in youth ministry for over a decade. So I come with a heart for the next generation. And that was in both parachurch and church-based roles. And I loved that. I felt very much at home in those roles. But in more recent years, I've moved into a denominational role with the Presbyterian Church here across the island of Ireland. So 2 countries, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland. We'll reflect on that later. And initially, I was in a training role in the area of discipleship. So some of what I'll talk about today kind of flows from that, but more recently then to give a lead to the mission of our church across Ireland. So that involves supporting churches in development phase, new church planting, overseeing some kind of bespoke mission projects, supporting a whole variety of mission workers, church planters, chaplains, evangelists. So that's kind of ministry. And then beyond that, I'm an elder in a fairly large congregation in the suburbs of Belfast. I used to be on staff there, but I just get to hang out and be part of the leadership team now and enjoy being part of that church.
Wonderful. Thanks for that introduction. I love that you are still deeply involved in the church that you were a pastor in. I think that is a beautiful thing. Most pastors move on to different spaces. I'm really interested. One of the things I love about this podcast and the role that I have within Luzon is being able to connect with people all over the world that are just have a deep sense of calling for what the Lord is calling into, and so often so unique to anything else I've seen. And so I'd be interested to hear from you what first stirred your passion for discipleship and mission, because not everyone is passionate about discipleship, particularly, and not everyone is passionate about mission. So what was it in your own journey that kind of sparked that interest and set you on that trajectory?
I mean, looking back, I think there's a personal way I'll answer that question, and then maybe more something that God has done in me in recent years, or maybe that I've noticed more widely. In terms of personally, I would say I was discipled in the context of mission. So when I served God in the midst of, for me, it was summer mission teams. Going to a different place for a few weeks and joining with mostly older Christians. For me, more mature Christians, and being around that kind of environment of sharing faith, and also of that kind of maybe more intense spiritual environment. I think those were massive spiritual moments for me in my own growth, serving God within my own church as well. I think when I served God, I I grew in my faith, and saw the kind of connection between discipleship and mission. But then, so that's part of my story. But I think a couple of things then more generally, there's probably been a growing sense. We're certainly seeing it in Ireland, maybe more generally in the West, of the strength of cultural formation in people, how in many ways society is discipling us, whether we're aware of it or not. And so the need to develop almost robust methods of counter formation to ensure we're primarily shaped by Christ and his ways. So, the importance of discipleship has really come home. I was going to say to me, but I think much more the church here more generally. And that has been something that we've been seeking to share across our denomination in recent years, and develop resources and training that might match that. Also, I think it felt like the pandemic perhaps revealed much of what had already been present beneath the surface here when it comes to spiritual formation. So suddenly gaps appeared in the church whenever we regathered again. Perhaps those gaps were already there, but not as visible, And so when habits were disrupted or relational ties had been loosened, maybe there was a kind of gap that was seen. And that gap for me was seen in the need for discipleship, spiritual formation, those kind of things. And maybe just, I might answer your question maybe in a more cheeky way, Jason, as well. We can be cheeky, us Irish people, from time to time. And I might just say, if it's not helping people to grow in faith, and it's not helping to reach people beyond the church, what is it that we think we're doing as the church? What else would we be doing than these two things as well? So for me, it's just, this is our calling. This is who we are. This is what the Lord ordained the church to do, and to be as well.
Yeah, I'm more than happy for you to get cheeky with us and push us a little bit in this direction.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm often thinking about the Great Commission, and I grew up hearing many missionaries speaking about the Great Commission and going and reaching unreached people groups, and it very much being about evangelism and proclamation and church planting. But what I'm noticing coming up through conversation with people is this reorientation back to what the Great Commission really is about, which is to go and make disciples. And if we are not doing that in any of these spaces, whether it's church ministry or mission, a parachurch ministry, all of our efforts need to be towards that goal of teaching people to obey. And so I would love to hear more about that from your perspective. A question I've been asking many people is to give me a definition, or their definition of discipleship. And so I would love to hear from you. What is your definition of discipleship, and how do you personally express, if someone says, "Hey, what is discipleship? Or what does it mean to be a disciple?" What would you say?
I think before there was the Great Commission, there was the Great Invitation. So Jesus on the shores of the Sea of Galilee invited those first followers of Jesus, come follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And straight away, you actually see a missional challenge in the midst of that invitation. But That's what I see discipleship primarily as. It's an invitation to follow, and then an invitation, obviously, to, or a challenge maybe to go, an invitation to follow, a challenge to go. But I found the Apostle Paul's description of how he lived among the Thessalonians to be a brilliant description of discipleship. So they're much better than my own words. So, chapter 2, verse 8, first letter to the Thessalonians, he writes that because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. And that's just a beautiful description, the importance of going deeper in the gospel. And so, discipleship isn't less than helping people understand the gospel, the sharing of that, but it's also sharing in Christian community with others. So, I love that kind of balance. Like, I know Lausanne talk about the two winged bird for other things, but actually the two winged plane for me of discipleship is the need to both speak the word and share our lives. And I think when both of those things are happening, there's both proclamation and community or invitation into some kind of community. I think that is where discipleship is going to be happening. And I'm maybe sometimes more a pictures guy than a words guy. So I love images. The idea of disciples as apprentices. I think that language is definitely maybe being picked up more recently in recent years globally in the Christian church. So that idea, the process of discipleship, we're learners, students. The root of the word disciple is mathetes, it essentially means students. So that picture that I haven't arrived yet. I've been following Jesus for 25 years, but actually there's more for me to learn and grow. Pick up Eugene Peterson's phrase, it's a long obedience in the same direction. So, and the other image for me in the New Testament is that of a farmer in a field. Again, Paul writes to the Corinthians, compares the idea of spiritual growth to that of a farmer in a field. It's not a factory where we just put the right things in and we expect the disciple to pop out the other end. It's actually that we sow and we water and we watch the ground and we weed. It takes time and there's patience. There's sometimes growth, but there's not overnight transformation. And yeah, so I just love those kind of pictures of there are maybe more process and growth and journey and apprenticeship and learning in the ways of Jesus.
So I want to dig in a little bit into that imagery of a disciple. If you had to paint a picture or describe what a disciple of Jesus Christ looks like compared to perhaps someone who is not, or a cultural Christian, how would you begin to distinguish between someone who's on the journey, who's proactively trying to become an apprentice of Jesus, to those who are not?
One of the ways, and this would be to define a disciple of Jesus as opposed to a cultural Christian, is someone who's living their life under the authority of, or maybe to use another word, the allegiance, to place their allegiance, their primary allegiance, sorry, is in Jesus Christ alone. And that then is, he is the authority from which everything else flows. So every decision, every plan, every hope, every ambition is filtered under the primary allegiance, of disciples of primary allegiance to Jesus. And I find that framing, I think it's John Mark Comer who talks about, the three things of being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, and learning to do what Jesus did. And I find that a helpful framework. So, to grow a disciple is, well, there's going to be some kind of spiritual devotion needed, but there's also personal transformation. And then there's also this kind of movement, outward movement. So a disciple for me isn't just someone who sits in a holy huddle and becomes nicer or even more moral. They're seeking to become like Jesus so that, they will serve him, and there'll be an outward dimension to their life as well. And I think as well, a disciple of Jesus might be someone who should be someone who gives their lives in and around the church, but conversely, just simply being around the church does not necessarily mean that somebody is a disciple. So yeah, those are kind of two different things.
So I'd be curious, you spend a lot of time in the church, you work a lot with the church and with church leaders in Ireland. Where do you see that like biblical definition of of allegiance to Jesus and apprenticeship to Jesus clashing with how many churches and organizations are approaching disciple making today?
Yeah, I think at first you want to say, it might be easy to be critical, and so I would want to start by saying that I do see healthy spiritual formation in many of the ordinary rhythms of what we do as a church, and so I think discipleship can happen in all kinds of ways: quiet formation through Sunday gatherings, regular preaching of the word, the communion of saints. I think it can happen, and it is happening. It does happen in small groups, intentional Bible study, people sharing their lives with one another, maybe inviting into people's homes, being around that. I think if I was to be, more critical or to push the church, maybe I would say at times I think we can lack intentionality in what we do. So perhaps we go through the motions or we miss the life on life nature of discipleship. So that kind of sharing of our lives beyond the formal and the organized. And that might be where, we can be tempted to substitute programs for proximity to people. So it's not that programs can't be used for people to grow in Christ, but where almost the attendance or the involvement in the program is seen as the end goal rather than the program as the bridge to learning or transformation or deeper relationship as well. And maybe another thing is just give for the church to give really good thought to ensure that there are clear pathways for discipleship. So if someone comes to faith, what's the next step? Are we ready to walk with them, or do we know what that looks like for them? What are we signposting them to? Are we ready to receive? There's a lovely little image. I think it's in Luke 5 where uh, Peter is mending the nets, and then just before a miraculous catch of fish, where Jesus enables them to catch, lots of fish. And there's this idea of the disciples are preparing what they're going to need. And I wonder for us as churches to think through, are we, maybe a church might say, well, we're not seeing lots of people come to faith at the minute. So why do we need to invest in, I don't know, a pattern or a resource or a pathway for somebody if they, you know, come to Jesus? And I would say, well, let's get those things ready now. Let's prepare the nets and let's think through our pathway. So, and maybe beyond that, are there clear avenues of service? So, and are we equipping people for that, or do we just drop them into the water and, expect them to swim? I do think discipleship happens in the ordinary and the everyday and the weekly rhythms of church life, but yet I also believe that there needs to be a great intentionality in those things and to kind of go beyond them in many ways into people's lives. It comes back to that, speaking the gospel, sharing our lives.
So I'd love to dig in a bit deeper here because an assumption that I have for those who are listening in, if they're regular listeners to this podcast, they have uh, possibly a deep love for God's mission, for His church, for the gospel to God, for lives to be changed, and that's why they listen into this podcast. Uh, if they had to ask you, if they say, "Hey, Rick, we heard you on the podcast. We want you to come in and just consult our church or our ministry organization on how we do discipleship," what would be those foundational things that you would be looking for? You've already mentioned one or two of them, but what questions would you be asking, and how would you go about trying to give advice and help these ministries and these leaders be successful in their discipleship efforts?
So I might begin with that pathway conversation and say, let's imagine somebody who is, rocks up at your church for the first time and shows some kind of an appetite or enthusiasm to at least hear more. Let's walk that journey with this person. Let's call him Jason. And how do we help Jason to how do we walk with him along the journey? And in terms of maybe consulting a church as well in their discipleship, another helpful framework I've reflected on and used actually in this kind of setting is reflecting on the different spaces that Jesus ministered in, as in the different kind of sizes of groups of people who he worked with, environments, you could call them. So essentially, Jesus worked and spoke and dealt with people in all kinds of environments. So from the 5,000, he was feeding obviously and teaching that kind of size of people, right down to the very few, the three, Peter, James, and John, that you could argue were in a very intentional discipling process or relationship. But I think there's some spaces in between as well. So there's the crowds, the 5,000, the Sermon on the Mount. There's this kind of wider community where Jesus was spending time in homes. There seemed to be more than the 12 around his life. He sent out the 12, but he also sent out the 70 or 72. Where does Mary, Martha, Lazarus, all of these people fit in? There was this wider group around Jesus. And then there's the core, I described them as. So Jesus shared his life with the 12. He identified them as future leaders, the apostles who he poured his life into, and they were with him in a quite a defined relationship, discipling relationship for 3 years. They were around his ministry. And then there's the three, Peter, James, and John, who are with him in the Garden of Gethsemane. They're with him in the Mount of Transfiguration. They're with him at certain healings. And then actually there's times where Jesus is with none of those people, and he's up a mountain, or he's at the other side of a lake early in the morning, and he's taking time with his Father. And I think it's helpful for a church to consider how it might provide or stimulate spiritual formation in each of these kind of spaces or ways. So our gatherings or weekly gatherings, I don't know if there's 5,000 coming to your church, but those kind of public spaces where anyone can rock up, are they part of spiritual formation? Are they part of helping people in a journey of discipleship? Is that what we see that as? But also to go beyond that, then to create spaces where community can develop, life on life discipleship can occur, to invest in the core in terms of deeper spiritual formation, maybe away from the crowds. What is there for people who want to go deeper, people who need to be equipped for mission or service or leadership, or just serving the Lord in their everyday lives. And then I think also a church could think about, how does it resource people in their spiritual disciplines as well? So it could be teaching on them, but it could be, here's a helpful resource. We could create a corporate rhythm that can be fostered across the church. We might pray at the same time every day, or we might ask ourselves the same questions around the dinner table, and we're going about our everyday lives, but actually we're equipping people for their kind of ordinary spiritual disciplines and devotion life as well. So I think that's been a helpful kind of paradigm for me. I've used that with different churches to say, let's talk about where do you lack focus, or where do you need greater intentionality? And if I'm honest, often it's the smaller a group gets, if that makes sense, or in the smaller numbers there, it's often a church saying, yeah, we might need to give more thought to intentionality in those kind of spaces.
I'm loving the paradigm that you're bringing into this, because this applies not only to churches, although I can understand why this is central. Like this should be happening in all churches, but it also happens within some ministry contexts where I have a number of organizations that are coming to mind right now that are trying to intentionally disciple and form Christ likeness and encourage those kind of journeys in the lives of people that they're ministering to. And so I'm loving this paradigm of what are the spaces, what are the sizes of groups that we're looking at, the spiritual habits and disciplines that I'd love to dive in with you a little bit deeper. But could we maybe like zoom out a bit and just talk more about this pathway? When you're speaking about this discipleship pathway, what exactly are you describing? Because I can imagine there's almost like a journey that's happening here. I know that some, the ministry context that I've come from in our evangelical kind of sphere kind of have like this discipleship 101, discipleship 202, like almost like these classes. And once you're done with the classes, now you're a fully fledged disciple. So you've gone through the pathway that the church has offered, although our church never really did that. So I want to clarify for our audience. But when you think of pathway, is it like this line, or is it more complex? And what are the big blocks in that pathway that you would want to bring out for our audience?
I actually think things like what you're describing can be helpful in terms of, but if they're only about knowledge and not about transformation, then I think they lack something, or they fall short. So I think there's something about discipleship and responsibility and helping people to own the next step on their journey. I mentioned earlier on the kind of initial invitation that Jesus gave to his disciples, follow me, and then I will make you fishers of men. But that part of fishing for people didn't happen right away. And Jesus took his followers then on a journey. And I, again, I've come to see kind of different stages of that journey, different stages of the invitations that Jesus gave. So he invited them to follow him. So there was a process of modeling, of watching, of imitation in many ways. Actually, before that, there's a invitation to come and see. John 1, Philip, Nathaniel, just come and see. And I wonder if that's the first invitation, just come and see Jesus, come and be around what we do as a church, look to him. I think then there's an intentional invitation to come follow, turn away from, leave down your nets, leave down what you're relying on, and pick up dependency on Jesus, follow me. So there's a kind of invitation, learning to do what Jesus did, or learn, just even reflecting on who Jesus was actually. And then there's this shift where Jesus encourages them later to take up their cross and follow him. So there's a cost, there's a suffering, or there's a challenge as well. There's an invitation Jesus gives to serve when he sends out the 12 and the 72. Actually, you now have a responsibility to be involved in my mission. It's not just come and see. It's not just, the story doesn't stop there. And then obviously at the end of the story, after the resurrection, well, that's only the beginning of the story, but after the resurrection, he's actually placing responsibility into their hands and saying, now you go and do likewise in many ways. Now you go and make disciples. So I think these hinge points are really important, and making sure they're really clear invitations or opportunities for people to step into the next part of their journey. And that's hard to do. I talked earlier about a factory and a field. It's really hard to do that in a kind of programmatic way. But I think if churches have opportunities for people to step in different parts of that story or that journey when they're ready to, that's brilliant. But then for the people that we might lead or know or seek to have an influence on, it's perhaps challenging them or giving them that opportunity at different parts of their journey. Does that make sense, Jason? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm loving these stages that you've just presented in terms of the invitations that Jesus gave to his disciples. I've never heard it being put like that, and I do believe that you can look at it as a leadership or as a leader and say, where am I offering those invitations to those we are ministering to go deeper in each of these spaces?
Yeah. So, I mean, to give you an example, I sat with a young guy in our church last night. He's probably been a Christian for about a year. Came to, I mean, how he came to faith was just incredible. He actually came to faith with no involvement at the church. He just, reached a crisis point in his life, began to watch Christian content on TikTok, began reading his Bible, and basically turned up at our church already having come to faith. And so enters then this quite, that he is the classic. He arrives at our church and we think, what do we do with him? What now? And so we plugged him into a group, and some of us have been looking out for him and trying to. So I met up with him last night anyway. I sat with him at our church last night, talking to him, and one of the things that I thought for him, he was beginning to talk about how he was serving God. So he was beginning to be asked to do things to help and to serve, and that's really really good, and he's found that helpful. But I just said to him, I travel around loads of different churches speaking, do you want to just come in the car with me? And his eyes lit up. He said, yeah, I would love to do that. I would love to see that. Now it's really boring. I drive to a different place and maybe I get out of the car and speak. But actually in that journey, there will be opportunities for me to talk to him. But I think if that continues the way I think it could, there might be opportunities for him to be involved in what I'm doing. Maybe there'll be times where he can do it instead of me, or am I talking through what, how do you teach the Bible to a group of people, or what might you say, or how do you minister in prayer, or whatever it is. And I just think we need to have eyes to draw people alongside us in whatever we do. That's maybe more a formal ministry setting I'm talking about, but how would we teach someone how to pray, for example? Well, actually, come and join me in prayer. Or how would we teach people to read the Bible? Well, actually, come and we'll read the Bible together. And it's that kind of alongside, but drawing them into the next stage, or another invitation.
Yeah. And it goes back to what you were saying earlier about that life on life discipleship, inviting people for their lives to intersect with your lives rather than just programs, although programs do help. And my wife and I have had similar conversations. How do we minister to those in our community? And we've just realized actually we need to open up our home. We need to invite those younger couples in to our home, see how we're raising our little girls, and just see life as it is rather than just life from the pulpit. And I want to just reinforce that and encourage those who are listening to consider how can you open up your own life to disciple others.
The CEO of Facebook, I think, I don't know if she still is, Sheryl Sandberg. She once was quoted by saying, now she was saying this in the context of social media, but she said, "You can't become what you can't see." And actually, if we apply that with a discipleship lens, actually, are we showing people our lives as well?
So I promised you that I'd give you opportunity to talk about spiritual habits. And so what kind of habits and practices and rhythms do you believe are essential for kind of taking that life and going deeper with Jesus, conforming to his image, becoming his apprentices?
I think if you had a bingo card for spiritual habits, you can get it out now, because you're going to get sort of maybe answers that you might expect. So, scripture, I don't think we can get away from that. Discipleship must be word centered. How are we helping people to become, how are we helping to grow a people of the book? And the word, prayer and intimacy, and reliance on the Lord. But maybe in both of those things, I think it's important to highlight the need to teach people to feed themselves. So, uh, it's easy perhaps for, I don't know, pastors, church leaders to jump to, okay, people, we need to ground people in habits of scripture and prayer. So I'll teach a 10-week sermon topic on that. But we have a 3-year-old daughter in our house, and we're at the stage where we're encouraging her to feed herself. It's quite messy at this stage. In some ways, it would be easier and quicker and far cleaner if I just put the spoon in her mouth. And we needed to do that last year because she wouldn't have had enough food to eat. But that's not going to help her in the long term. So we're getting her, the next phase of her journey is getting her to hold the spoon in her hand and reminding her, talk less, eat more, that kind of thing. So our role has become the coach rather than the feeder. And I wonder if, when it comes to spiritual practices, if we need to um, spoon feed people less and train people more for them to do this themselves. So actually, people can come to a brilliant Bible study where they hear someone, expound the word, but they may walk away at the end of that without actually having really engaged with the text for themselves. Or, you know, so are we getting people in front of the Bible themselves when they're with us? But by the way, too, so let's get out, let's read together and go through this, but also whenever they're on their own. And some other practices I might mention: the importance of Sabbath, withdrawal. So are we teaching people to set up, and modeling again, set a day apart every week for the worship of God, from withdrawal from work, all that, recentering our scattered senses upon his presence. And then in outward ways, I think there's practices, generosity, hospitality, you've mentioned, of modeling that within our churches and communities so that people can be formed as part of a family too, and that our reach can extend to those outside the family of God, perhaps through the table in our homes as well. So yeah, those kind of practices as well. But that'll get us started, won't it?
Definitely. No, I love the description. You said you liked images, and the image of a coach, I think is a helpful one. And definitely the picture of a little child learning to eat. It's messy and it's frustrating. Trying to help your children learn these practices, but at the end of the day, your love for your child enables you to make that decision to like go through that frustration, so that your little child can become an adult and live and have a being. So I really appreciate that, Rick. Rick, you also have a book on discipleship where people can dig in more into this. I just want to give you an opportunity just to let our audience know about that and where they can find it before we begin to chat about Ireland and
Oh yeah.
the mission
Yeah,
there.
let's get the Ireland. Yeah. Oh, the book quickly. Thanks, Jason. It's called Deep Roots of Resilient Disciples. It's really unpacking a lot of what we've been talking about. There's a chapter, sorry, on spiritual habits and disciplines. It was written kind of in response to what I've been talking about, maybe an observation of lots of cultural Christianity, of lots of, yeah, it was released a year after the pandemic. So, some of it was written in the midst of that as well. And it's really just helping to think about how do we put down deep roots? How do we help disciples to be robust enough to survive the culture, but uh, also in a way that engages with the culture, not just hides away. So actually, resilient disciples will be able to stand among the culture, but also to seek to be an influence among it as well, not in a kind of hiding away, but in an engagement way as well. So it just goes through 11 different habits, practices of a life of discipleship, and they're all from the Gospels or all from the life and the ministry of Jesus as well. And yeah, Deep Roots of Resilient Disciples. I think it is on Amazon, and yeah, for a global audience, maybe that's the best place to find it.
Wonderful. Okay, so I want to encourage those of you who are listening and want to dive deeper to go and find that. I'm going to put that in the show notes. You'll be able to go find that at the link that I'll share. So let's talk about Ireland. Let's talk about mission there. Ireland has a rich and complex spiritual history. So for those of us outside of your context, could you paint your picture? I understand that to try to do that in a few minutes is a difficult task, but I just want to give you an opportunity just to share with us what is going on in your country.
Yeah, just to begin by saying the cultural story of Ireland as a place and a people is so complex. It would probably take a whole series of podcasts to unpack, and I'm not sure you've time for that, Jason. But it's also quite nuanced. So there are things that I might say that feel like generalizations, and there are definitely anomalies within that, or differences within it. But in short, I think I could say that in terms of its spiritual story, this is an island that has two very contrasting narratives. So, if we want to go way back in history, the Reformation movement of the 16th century was strongly resisted in Ireland, particularly in the south and west of the island. Some of that was a religious resistance, but there were political reasons for resisting something that was being enforced by the King of England. So, it was possibly more political resistance, but I guess that led to a lack of openness to an evangelical or reformed way of doing things, and it led to an incredibly dominant Catholicism, much of which then became sort of intertwined with what it meant to be Irish. So being Irish and being Catholic almost went hand in hand, and so became enshrined in religious icons and spiritual pilgrimages, and the kind of strength of voice that the church, the parish priest, for example, would have had in a local community. So it almost formed a kind of cultural religiosity. So that's in the south, and then in contrast, that the Reformation did take more grip in the north and the east of Ireland. And then 100 years ago, when Ireland was partitioned in 1921, it effectively led to two completely contrasting religious environments side by side. So effectively, Northern Ireland has been described as one of the most evangelized places in the world, with more churches per capita than almost anywhere else in Europe, and traditionally high levels of church attendance. So I'm going back a generation, but that would have been the story. There's been a strong history of revivalism here. So evangelical revivals, the 1859 Ulster revival, it was kind of well known. It left a lasting cultural mark. And yet, I would say, even with all that heritage, some of that almost is tainted with the fact that it led or bred a kind of cultural Christianity here too. So maybe an adherence to the things of faith because it was part of the cultural norm, or it was just what you did. Maybe at other times, I need to be careful how I say this, but sometimes the faith and the version of Christianity here in Northern Ireland has been too closely entwined with British national identity and kind of unionist emblems rather than true Protestant values. And so when the Troubles broke out in Northern Ireland, which was a conflict that lasted 30 years, it was understood as a religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics, but actually it was nothing to do with faith at all. And it had everything to do with political and national identity, but those became the labels. And that has been a huge damage to the cause of the gospel. And so, in some ways, then you had this strong evangelical heritage in Northern Ireland sitting alongside the Republic of Ireland, which has been described as the least evangelized English speaking nation on earth because the number of evangelical Protestants stood at under 1% of the population. And yet, it was very difficult, or it became very difficult, to those from an evangelical or Protestant heritage to consider what mission looked like in the rest of Ireland, partly because there was a border that divided, but also in some places they might not have got a good hearing, or because conversion to Christ might appear to mean that I have to abandon my political or cultural ties to become part of your tribe, or at other times because of a lack of interest in reaching out to your neighbor. So, and it's more nuanced than that. There are exceptions, of course, and I maybe should say it's not to completely write off the Roman Catholic Church at all, um, in Ireland, but rather to say the key evangelical distinctives that I think the Lausanne missionary movement would hold to, such as the authority of Scripture, personal conversion, justification by grace through faith. They weren't strong features of the church landscape in Ireland. Um, yeah, but I suppose just to say that meshing together, it's complex because the meshing together of faith and national identity has deeply harmed the cause of the gospel. And actually, anywhere in the world where those two things happen, our experience has been that it ultimately it damages the cause of the church most, rather than someone's national identity. There's been rapid changes to those two pictures then in the last 20 years or so. So religious affiliation has essentially shifted sharply in both places. So in Ireland, Catholic identification and church attendance dropped dramatically. So in just over 3 decades, the stats are that weekly church attendance in the Republic of Ireland fell from 91%, which is incredibly high on one level, to less than 30%. That's in 30 years. And church, in some ways, church abuse scandals within the Catholic Church in particular dominated the landscape and were, national news, a national scandal, and the church lost its sense of moral authority. Um, and then the secular agenda, it was seen most visibly in two high-profile referendums. So, firstly, to legalize same-sex marriage, and then in 2018 to legalize abortion. And I'm aware as I say that in many nations across the world that would be considered maybe a norm, certainly in the West, but in Ireland, those two things would have been considered unthinkable a generation ago. And so it's led to Ireland being described as the fastest secularizing nation in Europe. So we're winning a lot of awards there, Jason. But alongside that, in Northern Ireland, then we can't be too proud because there's been a decline in church attendance here too, particularly among younger generations. And the recent census shows that no religion, that category, is growing really quickly. So um, evangelical communities are more of a minority. It's caused, I think, a loss of confidence in parts of the church here. So we're not as strong as we used to be. There's not as many of us as we used to be. We used to be listened to in the public square. We're not anymore. And so I think we need to almost rediscover what it means to spiritually form people when there's been a loss of the Christian narrative, and to more overtly reach out. So it's a really interesting moment in time. It's a huge missional moment, I think, on both sides of the border. In the north, we need to rediscover confidence and mission and retell the old story to a new generation. Maybe those who either don't have understanding or maybe the same baggage of the past. And for the rest of Ireland, then there's a pressing need to support existing churches, but also to see healthy churches planted. Because there are large parts of this island that don't have a strong evangelical witness.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate you painting a picture for us because in the midst of this, you are now called as an individual, Rick, to lead a mission in Ireland for your denomination. So tell us about that. What are you focusing on? You've shared with us the complexity of it all. What are you up to? How are you trying to advance mission and the gospel within your context?
Yeah, so to put it in figures, our denomination is 500 churches. And if you've listened well in the last 5 minutes, then it might not surprise you to know that over 400 of them are in Northern Ireland, which has just about 2 million people in it. And then we only have about 60 churches in the rest of the Republic of Ireland, which is about 4 to 5 million people living there. So, in terms of our mission, we really need to support the strengthening of healthy churches where they're already present, particularly further south and west. So there's large parts of the map where, are either missing or churches that are kind of maybe more isolated, certainly within our denomination. Of course, there are other healthy churches too beyond us. But actually, a big part of our story then is to see how we can develop more churches, plant more churches, see churches planting churches, send out kind of pioneer missionaries to try to reach people in the culture there as well. So it's already been happening, I have to say, in the last decade or so. We've seen some new church plants develop in recent years, some really encouraging stories of revitalization too. So that's what we want to stimulate and support. But we're setting a church planting target for the next decade within our denomination. So we're setting ourselves to see the planting of 10 new churches in the next 10 years. Plus, it's 10 new constituted congregations. So we've really some churches on the church plants on the journey. So we want to see them come to full status, full health and independence or strength, or trying to think of the right word. Sustainability, maybe, as a church plant. And then we want to start 10 other new church planting projects. So we've called this 10 plus 10 in 10. And that's part of the vision that we're going to try to be giving ourselves towards. So that will define how we resource, what we resource, what we try to develop, how we envision churches, to think about planting churches themselves, all of that kind of thing. So that's what we're really trying to set ourselves to.
Okay, so you've got this vision of 10 church planning, church revitalization. What are you learning so you've got the vision. What are you learning as you're beginning to engage with leaders within your denomination that could perhaps those who are listening can learn from, lessons from your own settings in these efforts?
One of the big learnings for me has been, or I don't know if it's been a new learning, but just a big underlining has been how mission always calls us to cross boundaries. And so if you just need to read through the early chapters of Acts, and you just see how the apostles were continually crossing boundaries to new places, to new kinds of people. So Jesus calls them to be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. There's loads of boundaries that are being crossed there. Boundaries from the city they were in to the region, to their nearby neighbors, stroke enemies, stroke people that that just weren't part of the same tribe. And then obviously, boundaries to the ends of the earth. And it's incredible to see in Acts how that, the church scatters actually through difficulty and through the sovereignty of God, actually. And, churches established. And the story that has given me most encouragement is the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. So here's someone already with an awareness of God attending worship, and someone who is already reading the Bible or the scriptures. But he needs someone to come alongside him, to be sent to him. And I'm fairly convinced that across this island, there are lots of people with an awareness of God. You can't be within this history and within this culture without an awareness of God. It's hard to be. And I think there's signs of an increased spiritual openness among younger generations in the UK and Ireland. Research to kind of back that up recently. So God will be at work in people's lives, but we might need to go to them, cross boundaries, find them. God will lead us towards them. So something about crossing boundaries, crossing borders, cultural barriers too. So, people who might consider, and within Northern Ireland, people who might consider themselves culturally Irish, culturally nationalist, Republican. Those are words that might mean something different elsewhere, but for us, that's their cultural affinity might be Irish, and we need to help them see that the gospel is not a barrier. That is not a barrier to their understanding of the gospel, and cross barriers generationally too, to make help the church be as accessible as possible to the next generation, and then to cross boundaries into places that we haven't previously been or gone before. So learning that the importance of vision too, casting vision. I think the importance of churches, planting churches. So pioneer mission is part of our strategy and but actually whenever a church can send a group of people up a road, we've seen that really helpfully in so the youngest Presbyterian church is just over 10 years old, and it has planted a church in the last 5 years. So there's something, it's a massive challenge just north of Dublin. They realized they had some people coming from the nearby town, and they thought, what if instead of them coming 20 minutes to come to church here, if we could gather something around them there so that they could, be closer missionally, I guess, as well. So churches planting churches, mission comes before worship often. We might want to gather people in church, but actually it's not attractional, it's missional. So we're trying to establish what mission looks like in the community and seeing if church might flow from that, if that makes sense. And then just lastly, it takes significant time and patience, and how prayer is the key to unlock doors that are way beyond us. We've seen God answer prayers in all kinds of ways to open door for us to begin a work in a part of Belfast that we thought wouldn't have been possible, or in a part of Ireland that we thought was a kind of no-go area. Those kind of things, the importance of prayer.
So I would love to give you an opportunity just to share some lessons with the global church. You mentioned just in the past 30 years how radically different Ireland is to what it was 3 decades ago, becoming one of the most secularized countries in all of Europe. This tends to be a trajectory for many Western countries, although we're seeing revival happening and sparks of renewal all over the place. What lessons from Ireland's journey do you think could really serve the global church? And what have you learned in this that you think would really serve the global listeners who are joining us?
Ireland was once known as the land of saints and scholars. It has been a sending nation. I'll use the phrase, it's punched above its weight, I think, sometimes in terms of how we've resourced mission globally and elsewhere. We've sent people to the nations. And yet I think we're in a period of history where we might need to learn to receive more in this season. I think humbly to receive more. I do think one of the lessons that could serve the global church here in Ireland is just how the movement of God's people and the movement of people more generally has actually been contributing to the revitalization of some of our churches, particularly in the South. So as people have come, there was something called the Celtic Tiger about 20 years ago, a boom in the economy of the Republic of Ireland, brought a whole bunch of people from the nations. You know what, Jason, I go to lots of our churches in the Republic of Ireland. I meet South Africans. I was preaching in a church just over the border on Sunday. I met a South African family who have not just joined the church, but got committed, really got involved and are making a massive contribution. That could be the case across lots of African nations in particular, actually, and some from Asia and Eastern Europe and the Americas too. But I think we are maybe learning to receive more in this season. And so there's a posture of humility that we need, a posture of dependency, a posture that we're not as strong as we used to be. And that might lead us to depend more on Christ, which I think is good for us. I know it's good for us. So that whole idea of Paul speaking that whenever he was weak, then he was strong. I wonder if when the church was actually at its strongest here numerically, if it was maybe at its weakest in terms of dependency. That's an easy phrase to throw out in a podcast. So I haven't always been here, I've lived here for 40 years, but but that's a sense I have that maybe we've relied on our strength too much and not dependent enough on his. I was talking recently to a pastor from Korea, from South Korea, and he told us a story of how 150 years ago in his nation, it was actually a Welsh missionary was involved in really the birthing of Christianity there and their story, certainly maybe in that region that he was a part of. And he was telling me then that his church that he serves has grown to maybe 100,000 people. It's just way outside my paradigm. Our paradigm, I don't know what to do with that kind of number of people. And he was telling me about how their church is resourcing mission across the nations now, and how that he now serves on a Bible college in Wales, on the board, sorry, of a Bible college in Wales. And I thought, what an amazing story. 100, and they have a vision as a church, I think, to resource like 1,000 church plants in Europe, in some way. So he's talking to me about, what we're doing in Ireland and how they could pray for us and support us. And it was just that narrative of, wow, a reverse narrative 150 years later of where. And so maybe there's something about, for the global church, a lesson of not resting on your laurels either, not assuming that if, there's wind behind you at the minute, and seeing a strong and healthy church, that's not a given, that's going to remain forever. And so again, it brings us back to that cycle at the start of our conversation today. What foundations do we need to lay? What roots do we need to help people grow, so that actually this is not a version of watered down Christianity, that's going to be acceptable within the culture, but actually this is a robust and a resilient kind of faith that will make a difference in all of our society. So that's what we're praying for within this land again.
I actually love that, because all of us can do with a little bit more humility in our own lives and our ministries. And I'm just reminded of 1 Corinthians 1, where God says he chooses the weak things. He chooses the foolish things of the world. And that in reality, that is us.
And maybe just to say, I think there's lots of biblical narrative here for us that is helpful for us, but it's not always the ones we might like. So it's the pictures of exile, picture of wilderness. In some ways, I think we have been in a spiritual wilderness, or that might be our language, our picture. I do get a sense the tide might be turning, and there might be a more spiritual openness in a younger generation here that haven't been scarred or tainted by uh, just our story, and maybe who are beginning to see that the secular story isn't as shiny as they might have been promised. So I think there is a turn of the tide, but actually that those pictures of exile, wilderness, exodus, actually, what were the people of God to do? So, characters like Daniel, I think Jeremiah's writings are helpful for us.
So, Rick, they may very well be other leaders, just like that Korean leader who connected with you, that is interested in doing work in Ireland. Or maybe someone's listening to this and they're saying, I need to connect with Rick for whatever reason, or any resources that you have. How can people find you online? How can they connect with you, find any of your books or resources?
Well, I've just the one book. So we mentioned that earlier. That's on Amazon. I'm present on social media. If there's anything in terms of the story of our church that's interested you, you could certainly Google the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, church website, and search there for Mission in Ireland, and you might be connected to some of the church planting and mission projects that I've been talking about today. But yeah, I'm on social media: X, Instagram, Rick Hill NI, Rick Hill NI. And yeah, I do blog a little bit, rickhill.wordpress.com. You can maybe stick that in the show notes. But um, yeah, blog occasionally now, would be what I would say, but sporadically. But yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to be sure to put that in the show notes for those who are listening, and want to connect with you. As we wrap up, any final thoughts? We've taken this conversation in many different directions, but I'd love to give you an opportunity just to share final thoughts with our audience.
Yeah, I think I would say just discipleship is so ordinary, and mission is often so local to begin with. And so I'd say for anyone, get plugged in where you are, serve local, but also then consider, is there a boundary that God's calling me to cross? What's the boundary that might be there within our community, within even a kind of family context, or within a nation too? So I think that's been my story, that when more recently, as I've been seeing the church cross boundaries, actually, I've been noticing that God tends to be already there, and we join with Him in His great mission.
Wonderful. Rick, with those final words, I just want to thank you for the time that you've given to me and to this audience. And I'm going to encourage everyone that is listening to take a moment to pray for Rick, pray for Ireland, pray for mission, pray for the gospel to go out. And let's pray that God would, he's already on mission, like you just said, that he would remove this tide of secularism and that there would just be disciples that begin to pour out of Ireland. So, Rick, thank you so much for your time. It's been a blessing.
Thank you so much, Jason.